Welcome everyone to the May 6th edition of Washington Walks Webinar Wednesdays. It's raining. If this was a Washington Walks walking tour, we would, of course, rain or shine, we'd be going. But instead, we're indoors, rain or shine. I'm really happy to be able to share today's webinar with my colleague, Martin Murray. We called it From Pete and Walt to Lucy and Mary, honoring DC's rainbow history. And we will get to that in just a moment, but let me take this opportunity to let you all know that all our webinars now, thanks to our fantastic administrative person, Victoria, are on-demand viewing opportunities on our YouTube channel, Washington Walks. You can also find them now on our website, washingtonwalks.com, by clicking on webinars. And very shortly, when this one is done, this one will be on our YouTube channel and available through the website as well. Tonight, just a preview of our DC in the Movies webinar series, Mike Canning, film critic and DC movie expert, and I are going to be discussing the 1976 film, All the President's Men. But let's now go into the 19th century and early 20th century with Martin Murray. Hello.
Hi, Carolyn, how are you?
And we should let folks know that this webinar is kind of inspired by two walking tours. One, which you lead, the one of the Brookland neighborhood, and that's where the Lucy and Mary part of the story originates. But then we were intending to debut a brand new walking tour that you were leading, Rainbow History DC. And it was going to be a wonderful overview of sites in Washington that are important to the LGBT community. But we're going to get a little preview of that in the Pete and Walt part of the webinar. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, Martin, and I will let you share yours.
Okay.
And we'll tee up your presentation.
All right. Can you see the first slide there, Carolyn?
I cannot, but fear not, we'll figure it out. We always do. This happened to me last week with Jacqueline Kennedy. I was sharing my, indeed I was sharing my screen, but I was sharing the wrong part of my screen.
Let's see, I think maybe I need to push share screen.
Yeah, that's right. Just push share screen, right, click on that. Here it comes.
All right.
It's coming. There it is.
Okay,
great.
Now, from beginning. Slideshow. Great. So what we're seeing here is 1256 Kearney Street, which was the home of Lucy Dick Slowe and Mary Powell Burrell.
So those are that's the Lucy and Mary of our story.
The Lucy and Mary of our story. So we're sort of starting chronologically backwards, but perhaps some ways more importantly, because this house was just recently designated a landmark, a DC landmark, by the Historic Preservation Review Board. And how that came about, in December 2019, the DC Preservation League, as well as the owners of this house, the O'Connells, wrote up an application to have it listed with the National Register of Historic Places. And the process basically is twofold. First, you go to your local history office, your state history office. In this case, we have the Historic Preservation Review Board. They review the application. If they're okay with it, they approve it. And then they go ahead and forward it to the National Register. So just last week, breaking news, April 30th, HPRB did approve the listing of this on the DC's Register of Historic Places, and then it will go forward to the National Register.
So we're feeling very prescient here on our webinar, aren't we?
Yes.
But folks should know that this is a site that we added. Now maybe this would have been the second year to our Brookland neighborhood walking tour.
Yeah.
So some folks who've been on that tour with you and our guide Hayden, they will have seen this site.
Right, right. And the reason it was nominated is because if you go back about 5 years, the National Park Service was looking at its list of historic properties, and they noticed there was lacking in social history of minorities, women, and marginalized communities. So they basically went back to the states and said, you know, we would really welcome applications in those categories. So the Office of Planning, DC Office of Planning, took the initiative to look at a lot of different sites in DC, came up with a preliminary list, and then they basically charged the DC Preservation League with writing up a nomination, see if it would pass muster. They did that with the funding from the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and we ended up with this nomination and this designation now.
So then I'm curious, I don't want to get too in the weeds here, but because I know that you've done work on DC's Rainbow History, did the DC Preservation League hire or contract with local historians or people with experience writing these nominations to actually do that work?
There was actually a funding grant from the, I think NPS may have given a funding grant to DC, and then they in turn funded the DC Preservation League. They hired EHG Traceries, which you're probably familiar with,
Yeah.
who does an awful lot of local history, particularly if you're interested in house history,
Right.
and came up with the application. But the reason it was put on there is because Lucy Diggs Slowe and Mary Powell Burrell are considered to be perhaps one of the foremost same-sex couples in early 20th century Washington, D.C. And that was the reason they were nominated. In addition, Lucy Diggs Slowe herself is a very prominent person. Mary Powell Burrell, really good person. We're going to talk about her a little bit. But Lucy Diggs Slowe, more prominent as the first Dean of Women, African-American Dean of Women in the United States, happened to be at Howard University. So that was the reason it was nominated. And then the other thing that's interesting about the nomination is it will be the third DC landmark associated with LGBTQ history. The other two, the Dr. Franklin E. Kameny House. Dr. Kameny, of course, going way back to the 1950s with the founding of the Mattachine Society. He was a great gay civil rights leader, fought against the criminalization of sodomy, fought for security clearances for government employees. He himself was fired from the government for being gay, and other landmark work. And the other one is a lesbian collective called the Furies.
Yeah, the Furies, right.
And that was nominated as well. Furies dates back to around 1971, an important publication for the lesbian separatist community, basically. So this will be the third LGBTQ site here in the District of Columbia. So let's talk a little bit more about these two women. You can see their dates. Mary Powell Burrell was just a few years older than Lucy Diggs. Here they're sitting in their garden at Kearney Street. Lucy Diggs Slowe, Dean of Women at Howard University, is sitting in her lawn chair, and Mary is sitting on the armchair's rest. The garden would have been an important site for socializing. For, of course, Lucy Diggs Slowe is Dean of Women at Howard University, have to have garden parties. She always had a party for her graduating seniors, the women in her class, faculty events. She also welcomed other educators like Mary McLeod Bethune. She was very close friend to Bethune. And then Mary Burrell, she was a teacher as well. She taught at Dunbar High School, the preeminent African-American high school in the days of segregation. And she taught a lot of students who would later go on to claim as part of the new Negro movement, or the Harlem Renaissance as it's known, many of whom were Washingtonians. They have a neighbor, Sterling Brown, is 2 doors down, and he would go crazy when they call it the Harlem Renaissance. He said, you know, most of those people weren't from Harlem, a lot of them were from here in DC.
Yeah, but it's so neat that folks won't realize that, yeah, just a couple doors down from this home is already a historic site, landmark, is the Sterling Brown residence.
Right, right. And then another person from the Harlem Renaissance, Georgia Douglas Johnston. And she was an African-American poet and writer, but more importantly, probably a mentor to many of these same people like Jean Toomer, Mary Burrell, who was a playwright herself, Langston Hughes, Miller. So kind of an important place for meeting basically the Black intelligentsia of the early 20th century in this garden. Now this is let's focus a little bit on Lucy Dean Slowe. This shows her as a student at Howard University. She was just a remarkable person and somebody that the term first is usually associated with. She was the first person in her graduating class at the Baltimore Colored High School to go to Howard University. More or less worked her way through because she comes from a poor family. She was orphaned at the age of 6 and raised by her aunt. While she was Howard University, she was a founding member of Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, the first African-American sorority in the United States. I often think that Lucy Diggs Slowe would be really delighted to know that other succeeding members of the Alpha chapter of Alpha Kappa Alpha, that is at Howard University, included a Nobel laureate, Toni Morrison, the first African-American woman to lead the city of Washington, D.C., Sharon Pratt Kelly, and the first African-American senator from the state of California, Kamala Harris.
Oh, wow.
And will she
You
be
know
the
what,
first
Martin?
African-American vice president?
I know, it started here. Some folks are having a little bit of difficulty hearing you.
Oh, okay. I know I have my little,
I know.
is this a little bit better?
Yes.
Maybe? Okay.
Yep.
So if you all don't mind my holding this out, I think that'll help.
I don't mind.
Okay. Now, of course, she started, when she was at Howard University, she studied education as well as English, went on to teach at the Baltimore Colored High School, which was her alma mater, came back to Washington teaching at Armstrong Manual High School, which was one of the 2 African-American high schools of its day. And then she was tasked, because she was such a good educator, of opening the very first junior high school for African-American students, also named Armstrong Junior High School. In the meantime, while she's working as an educator, she also was a great athlete. And Lucy Slowe has the distinction of being the very first African-American woman to win a national title, sports title. In this case, she won the American Tennis Association Women's Singles Champion title, 1917, 1921, and 1922. All in all, she won something like 17 different different titles. So she was a remarkable person in so many different ways. Of course, we really applaud her because she was the first African-American woman to be a dean of women at an American university, and that was at Howard University. 1922, she was appointed dean. And she was really instrumental in encouraging women to branch out a little bit. Of course, she was an educator, and of course she believed in education, but in those days, pretty much that was the only career path that was open to women. But she said, no, you really need to move into other careers as well, such as medicine, social work. She was instrumental in starting or helping to foster the beginning of the School of Social Work at Howard University. So she had a remarkable influence there at Howard. This is shows another one of her accomplishments where she basically was responsible with Howard University's architect at the time to develop the women's dormitory, and they called it the women's campus. And we had these 3 beautiful new campus buildings that are in the background there. This is shortly after it was opened up. They were named for various African-American female leaders, including, you'll see, Sojourner Truth Crandall and Frazier. this picture, we see Lucy Slowe. She's in the very front row. She's the fourth person from the front. And she's pictured there with her colleagues at the National Association of Deans of Women. Now, the National Association of Deans of Women was an all-white organization until Lucy Slowe, after she became Dean of Women at Howard, she put in her application, they reviewed it, and they said, come on and join us. So she integrated that organization.
You know what I'm thinking of? It's this, so this time period, this photo is 1932, and I'm just thinking 7 years later, here comes Marion Anderson, and she approaches, or people on her behalf, local NAACP approaches another then all-white organization, the Daughters of the American Revolution, to sing at their hall, and she's turned down. And that ends up becoming where she does sing at the Lincoln Memorial, a historic moment in American DC civil rights history. But well, how nice to know that 7 years earlier, here was an all-white organization willing to integrate.
Right. Well, you mentioned Marion Anderson, and Lucy Diggs Slowe was also instrumental in bringing Marion Anderson, as well as other prominent African Americans of the time, to the university campus to both perform and also to provide a mentorship role for the students. And that was a kind of an important part of her job as the Dean of Women. It was mentoring. And one of her other distinctions is she was the person to initiate freshman orientation.
Really?
You're a Howard University student, and you participate in freshman orientation, which was a new movement at the time. Back then, they just figured throw the students at the university, let them sink or swim. But Lucy Slowe was very good at looking at what other universities were doing, whether they were African American or white, and then bringing those innovative ideas to her own campus, including the idea for the women's dorms. And she basically designed the dorm rooms to make them amenable to the women students using them.
Wow.
Another thing that she did that she's credited with was she joined with Mary McLeod Bethune in starting the National Council of Negro Women.
Oh, so okay.
And
wow.
she married, or Lucy was the first executive secretary of that organization. Of course, now we know that Mary McLeod Bethune's home and office is also on the list here in DC on Vermont Avenue, I believe it is. Now, her time at Howard was an unalloyed success because she was really the victim of, I guess we would call, sexual discrimination. Even though she was heralded by most of her colleagues, the students loved her, the parents loved her, the alumni loved her, she had a little bit of an enemy in this man, who's Mordecai Wyatt Johnson. Wonderful person in his own right, of course. He was the very first African American to be a president of Howard University. Prior to his coming in, it was run by white people, and most of the teaching staff for a long time were white people. But Mordecai Johnson, for some reason, did not like Lucy Slowe. And one of the things that he did, she was appointed by his predecessor. When he came in, he excluded her, even though she was Dean of Women, from the Board of Deans that Howard University had. He made sure that her salary was kept at a level lower than all of the other deans.
Oh, no.
And he would provide sufficient funding for her programs. And then probably the biggest insult of all was he ordered basically Lucy Slowe to move from her house on Kearney Street, which she shared with Mary Burrell, to the Howard University campus. Well, it would be common for a women's campus dormitory to have what was called a matron, but a matron is not a dean. And most deans, the Dean of Men, for example, on campus, were permitted to live off campus. And Lucy Slowe fought it. She got people like Mary McLeod Bethune behind her, pressuring the alumni and others. And eventually, Johnson never did back down, but Lucy never did move.
Oh, she never knew. Do
She
you
never moved.
do
Yeah.
you think that there could be a number of reasons why he made that rule for her to follow? Do you think he objected to her living with Mary?
That that is a speculation that some people have had. It's not really that clear that he would have had that prejudice. We really don't know. He was a famed orator and preacher, but Lucy Diggs Slowe and Mary Burrell were both very active in the YWCA, for example, Christian organizations. So it's really not clear. At one point, Mordecai Johnston himself was under investigation for being a communist. So he may have had very progressive views. We don't know. So whether it was an act of homophobia, there's no documented instance of that. But he may have simply had the sexism of a man of his era and didn't really care for the prominence that Lucy Slowe was showing and independence, really. Well, Lucy Diggs Slowe, of course, she did die relatively young age, in her early 50s, of kidney disease, 1937. Her funeral was at Howard University's Rankin Chapel. Interestingly, Mary Burrell, of course, as her principal heir, was in charge of the funeral service. She told Mordecai Johnston that he could come, but he was not going to be participating in the program. But she did invite Robert Todd Duncan to come and sing. Now, it sounds like you know who Robert Todd Duncan is.
I sure do. Boy, I guess, well, if people recognize his name, he was he portrayed Porgy in the original production of Porgy and Bess, but then taught at Howard, right?
And you taught at Howard, yeah, starting in 1930.
Yeah.
And he was also an acclaimed voice teacher at Howard University.
Right.
And he had only just, 1935 is when he premiered as Porgy in Porgy and Bess, came to Washington in 1936 and integrated the National Theater with their production. He said, if I'm going to sing here, you cannot restrict where my people are sitting in your theater. And in 1937, he sang for Lucy Slowe at her funeral. And this window was dedicated around 1941, and in the chapel. Another interesting thing about the chapel is that Mary Burrell, every year, Mary Burrell and Lucy Dean Slowe would put on a Christmas Vesper service. And it was mostly Mary Burrell as a playwright. She would put together the program, and then she would have people perform it. So it has a lot of meaning to them. Other ways in which Lucy Diggs Slowe was honored after her death included having an elementary school in her neighborhood in Brookland named for her. Unfortunately, it has closed subsequently, fairly recently. And she also has a dormitory at Howard University named for her. But the most curious thing is this. Tunnel boring machine, which Mayor Bowser officially named the Lucy Diggs Slowe Tunnel Boring Machine, with the First Avenue project done by DC Water. And it's kind of funny, when I first saw this, I was just confused by it, and I had lunch with my friend Kim Roberts one day, and I was telling her about this webinar, and I said, we're going to be talking about the boring machine. She said, oh, isn't that funny, the boring machine? I said, I don't get it though. She said, well, Lucy Diggs Slowe, just like the boring machine Diggs Slowe. Obvious.
Well, Martin, I mentioned this when we were talking earlier this week. My first encounter with her name was being on a walking tour with our colleagues Brian Kraft and Sarah Schoenfeld of the Bloomingdale neighborhood. And at the time, this machine was indeed boring underground down, I don't know, 3rd Street, 1st Street. And there was a big banner celebrating her and saying, yeah, we decided to name this in her honor. But of course, it with it. Boring, because it did go very slowly.
Yes, yeah. Well, those boring machines are really remarkable. I mean, they're using them now in New York to dig.
Oh, and you know what? Someone who's listening is wondering, and maybe some participants are wondering the same thing. You know, grammatically, it should really be Lucy digs slowly, right?
This
You
is
know.
true. This is true. Now, the other part of the power couple is Mary Powell Burrell, who is a few years older than Lucy, also an educator, and even though not as famous as her partner Lucy, but also a very important woman in her own right. She was a native Washingtonian. She was one of the first African American graduates of Emerson University. Came here to Washington to teach, taught at Armstrong High School, same school that Lucy Diggs Slowe taught at for a while before becoming Dean of Women at Howard University. And then she moved on to Dunbar High School. And in that capacity, she worked there until 1944. So she had a very long career at Dunbar, roughly 1912 to 1944. Taught English, but more importantly, dramatics. And in that capacity, she mentored an awful lot of people who then gained greater prominence in the African American, New Negro, Harlem Renaissance movement, including Jean Toomer was probably her student at Dunbar, because he was also a native Washingtonian, graduated from Dunbar.
For folks who are participating who may not be, I mean, of course, we still have a Dunbar High School in Washington, D.C., not too far from North Capitol Street and New York Avenue, but it has a real significant place in DC, not only education history, but African American history. The era where she would have been teaching there probably might have been considered the golden age of that public high school, wouldn't you say?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, definitely. That was pretty much where all of the prominent leaders came from. Armstrong was certainly a very good school, but it was a manual school. So it wasn't for people who were considering professional careers largely, but Dunbar certainly was.
But if you
and
were
people like Ralph Bunch,
yeah,
Charles
you
Weaver.
could have been taught at that high school, a DC public school, in segregated times for African Americans, but your teachers would have had sometimes master's degree, PhD caliber educations.
Right.
And there they were mentoring.
You would really get the creme de la creme, especially the African American educators, because at the time, the DC was also still, prior to home rule, if you were a DC teacher, it was a federal job. And you wouldn't face discrimination as you would elsewhere, and you would be paid a federal salary. So it was a very, very good job to have. And people like, for example, Lucy Slowe, she took a pay cut when she became Dean of Women at Howard University.
Wow.
Because the district paid its teachers well enough. I wouldn't say too well, because teachers deserve all the money they can get. Another person that Burrell had mentored was a student named Willis Richardson. And Willis Richardson is a name few people are familiar with, but she was the very first African-American woman to have a play produced on Broadway, 1923. She was a student and she was taught the art of drama by Burrell. Now, Burrell herself was also a playwright. She had two plays that were published. One play was concerned birth control. It was called They That Sit in Darkness, and it was published in Margaret Sanger's publication.
Isn't that amazing?
Margaret Sanger, of course, was a woman who really introduced birth control and made it something that we really needed to adopt as a progressive policy. And then the other play was called Aftermath, also published in a very progressive publication, The Liberator, which was a publication by Max Eastman, the socialist. And Aftermath talked about what happens to an African-American soldier returning from World War I, goes back to his home in the South, and faces, of course, violence and discrimination upon his return.
That's remarkable. We managed in the District of Columbia to observe the year 2019 and did a really poor job, I'm afraid, of recognizing and telling the story of a very important post-World War I event, a violent event that occurred here in 1919, and that was a race riot that kind of started in Southwest and made its way up 7th Street into the Shaw neighborhood. And in large part, it was African Americans, many who had fought in World War I, defending themselves, defending their property against whites, angered whites who just went on a rampage. But it was a terrible time for African American soldiers who had served admirably and in many cases had been feted and participated in parades in European cities, particularly France, once the war is over, and they come back to America. They come back to Washington, D.C., their hometown, and they are facing vile discrimination and receiving very little accolades.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's really an important part of our history to remember. Now, Burrell continued after Lucy Slowe passed away in 1937. Burrell pretty much sold the house rather quickly, moved into an apartment near Howard University campus, continued at Dunbar till 1944. Then she moved to New York, where she died in 1946. So that's kind of basically the career of Burrell and Slowe. And now we're ready to move on to our earlier couple, I think. Okay.
I recognize that. I have that.
This is a
I have that in
brochure
a file.
that was done in 2005. That was produced by Kim Roberts and myself for the Rainbow History Project. It was part of a celebration we did in 2005 to celebrate the 150th anniversary of the publication of Leaves of Grass, 1855. And it was part of really a citywide celebration, the Washington Friends of Walt Whitman, which I founded in the mid-1980s, and other local organizations, including a lot of places like the Ford's Theater, the Arts Club of Washington, DC Public Library, et cetera, joined together to do some programming. And Kim Roberts chaired the effort, and this was one of our productions here. Tells a little bit about Whitman's life here in Washington. As Carol, you probably know, because we've talked a lot about Walt Whitman over time. But Whitman was, of course, a famous poet by the time he arrived in Washington, published Leaves of Grass in 1855, to a lot of acclaim, if not notoriety, because it was a book that celebrated all aspects of American life. And it was considered a little bit risque, even though today we would think it was pretty tame. People thought it was pretty wild, talking about sex, sexual love between a husband and wife, talking about same-sex love between men. So he was a bit of a notorious figure when he arrived. Came here in 1863, basically intending to stay only briefly because his brother was wounded in a battle of Fredericksburg during the American Civil War. He went to Fredericksburg, found his brother. Brother was quickly recovering from his wound, but Whitman decided that this was a great opportunity to serve the country by serving the wounded soldiers of the war. Stayed in Washington, D.C. throughout the war and spent a lot of time writing about the war for journals, such as the New York newspapers. He originally was a journalist himself. Wrote for the New York Times, the Brookland Daily Eagle about his wartime ministry to the wounded. And then started, of course, writing poetry, which he's best well known for, and published a collection of war poems called Drum Taps to great acclaim. This shows one of the hospitals that he frequently visited. I don't know if you can recognize the site, but if you're looking up the mall, this is basically where the Air and Space Museum would be today. Yeah. And it shows, of course, the mall and the Capitol in the background, lithograph that was done. Whitman spent a lot of time in this particular hospital because, as he said, it contained the worst wounded of the war. The reason being it was the closest principal hospital to the 7th Street wharves
I
on
wondered
the
about
Potomac
that.
River.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, of
Yep.
course, you have all these battles in nearby Virginia. They're shipping them by barge to the district, and then they're bringing them into the hospitals. If they couldn't go any further, they stayed at Armory Square Hospital. So Whitman befriended many, many soldiers there, and unfortunately saw many, many of them die. Now, the other thing that he did was he chronicled Abraham Lincoln's assassination. And that was something. Whitman was very fond of walking the streets of Washington, and his walks, he would often see Abraham Lincoln riding from the White House up to the old soldiers' home.
Mhm.
And Whitman would say he would salute Lincoln, and Lincoln would salute him back.
Mhm.
But he was really devastated, of course, as the nation was when Lincoln was assassinated. And he wrote two of his probably most famous poems in honor of Lincoln: "Oh Captain, My Captain," which you may have had to recite as a school child, and probably more beautifully and significantly, "When Lilacs Last in the Dooryard Bloomed." Now, towards the end of the war, Walt Whitman finally got some relief from the wartime agony in a friendship with a young man named Peter Doyle. And this shows a picture of them taken about 1867 by a local photographer called Moses P. Rice. He had done in a studio here in Washington, D.C. And Whitman and Doyle, basically Doyle was a conductor on the Washington Street horse cars, they called them, rail cars on the street. Whitman was visiting a friend, John Burroughs, in Capitol Hill, got into Doyle's horse car. Whitman was the only passenger. Doyle went back to talk with him.
It's so great. It's like a romantic comedy. It's great.
Doyle recalled that he put his hand on Walt Whitman's knee, and he said from that time on they understood one another.
Yeah.
So after that, they were constant companions. They would go to Center Market. They would buy fruit. Of course, Whitman would go to Center Market to buy fruit for the soldiers, which Whitman continued to visit long after the war was over. They would walk down the Potomac River. Whitman would be reciting sonnets by Shakespeare, and we assume that Peter Doyle was reciting back limericks since he's from Limerick, Ireland. And they would also love to attend the Marine Band concerts, which were then held on the lawn of the White House. The band leader at the time was a man named Scala, Francis Maria Scala, who he was really the very first director of the Marine Band with that title throughout Whitman's years, and he trained Sousa. Sousa played under Scala and eventually took over the role. Now, we know a lot about Walt Whitman, of course, but maybe not so much about Peter Doyle. So just like Mary Burrell is perhaps the less well-known partner, Peter Doyle certainly is here. And in some ways, Doyle is kind of an odd companion for America's poet, because Doyle was Irish-born. He was an Irish immigrant, born in Ireland during the Great Hunger, as the Irish call it. We call it the Great Famine, 1843. Family escaped to America, as did many Irish immigrants. Father was a blacksmith, worked in Alexandria, and then in Richmond, faithfully, as it turned out, because when Peter Doyle became 18, he was living in Richmond at the time, had been living there as a teenager, and joined the Fayette Artillery, a Confederate unit, served in the war as a rebel soldier. Battle of Antietam happens. Walt Whitman's brother George is fighting on the Union side. Peter Doyle is fighting on the Confederate side. Doyle is wounded, taken to a hospital in Richmond. The family says, "We really don't want you fighting anymore, Pete. You're going to kill yourself." He took advantage of a loophole, if you will, that a lot of Irish did at the time. And he said, "Since I was born a British subject, I remain so. And you have no hold on me here in the Confederacy." The Confederate government was really hoping to get Britain's support for the war, and they acknowledged these petitions. So Doyle was able to leave service. He came to Washington, D.C., started working as a conductor on the horse cars. And eventually, what happened with Whitman and Doyle, they remained constant companions until 1873. 1873, Whitman, on one cold winter's evening, was reading at the Justice Department headquarters building. Then it was in the Treasury building that we know today, but it was part of the Justice Department. Had a stroke. Doyle helped him for a while, but Whitman decided he really needed to leave Washington, settle in Camden, where his brother George was living at the time. And eventually Whitman died in 1892 in Camden, New Jersey, where he's buried. After 1873, Doyle started working for the Pennsylvania Railroad. And eventually he moved to Philadelphia, not far, of course, from Camden, New Jersey. He and Whitman continued their friendship. And when Whitman died, Doyle was present at the funeral at Harley Cemetery in Camden, New Jersey. The picture on the right shows Peter Doyle, roughly the age of 57, not long before his death, and shows a very handsome man, I think. Now the other thing I'll point out about Peter Doyle, Washington connection, he is buried here in Washington's Congressional Cemetery because his sister, her name was Catherine, she married a man, German cabinet maker. They stayed in Washington, D.C., and Peter Doyle, after he died, he was brought to Washington. Congressional Cemetery kind of had importance for the Doyle family because Peter Doyle's older brother was a police officer in the Metropolitan Police Department, as it was called back then. And tragically, he was the very first officer killed in the line of duty from DC. He was buried to a great fanfare, if you will, in Washington's Congressional Cemetery, and then that became the burial home for the rest of the Doyle family, and that's why Peter Doyle is there today. A couple of years ago, the Washington Friends of Walt Whitman, along with our friends at Chrysalis Arts and Culture Group, planted a lilac bush next to Peter Doyle's grave. And it's funny, I was at the cemetery not too long ago talking with Paul Williams, who's the director of the cemetery there, and we were talking about whether or not anybody ever comes to visit Doyle's grave. He said he gets a lot of requests, actually. And when people ask how do they find the grave, he said, just look for the lilac bush. So we did something good there for Peter Doyle. Now we're transitioning just a little bit, although it does involve Walt Whitman and part of our Gay Rainbow History Tour. This is the site of the DuPont Circle Metro entrance, which probably most of the people watching are familiar with. And we see DC Council Member Jim Graham at its dedication of what is the HIV/AIDS Caregivers Monument. And Jim Graham had the idea starting around, he had the idea actually for quite a while because I can remember talking with him over the years about doing something to honor both Whitman and caregivers during the AIDS crisis. And ultimately, it was decided that the Metropolitan WMATA and the DC Arts and Humanities sponsored this installation. Now, of course, today we're faced with the coronavirus pandemic, which is why all of us are holed up in our homes. But of course, we reckon back to that earlier pandemic starting in 1981 and the millions of people who have been infected and have died of that disease is quite daunting to remember. Jim Graham wanted to honor those people. Jim Graham, of course, was the perfect person to be in charge of this honor because he was the principal person in charge of the response to the AIDS pandemic here in Washington, D.C. Starting in 1981, which was the same year when the CDC first reported on this mysterious disease that was killing gay men. He took the helm of the Whitman Walker Clinic. The Whitman Walker Clinic also was named for Walt Whitman. Walt Whitman and Dr. Mary Walker, a Civil War doctor. And Jim Graham stayed there for nearly 20 years through the height of the pandemic. So he really, when I'm at that monument, I think of Jim Graham in particular. Now, of course, it has the poem by Walt Whitman, which is from his Wound Dresser poem, and that's a poem that Whitman wrote here during the Civil War, commemorating those soldiers that he was taking care of during the war. If I can just read the excerpt from it. Whitman is kind of recalling visiting the hospitals, and he says, "In silence, in dreams, projections, returning, resuming, I thread my way through the hospitals. The hurt and wounded I pacify with soothing hand. I sit by the restless all the dark night. Some are so young. Some suffer so much. I recall the experience, sweet and sad." But in addition to Whitman, we also have a poem by another prominent DC poet, a contemporary of ours today, Ethelbert Miller, who, rounding back to Howard University, was on the faculty of Howard University for many years, including when he was selected to provide this poem. It's called "We Embrace." This part of the monument we don't usually see very much, do we? We're kind of all familiar with the beautiful Whitman quote at the entrance to this, but this is off to the side where the elevator is. But it's also quite a beautiful part of the monument, and the poem that Miller has penned, I think, has quite a bit of resonance even for us today in the midst of our own pandemic. We embraced. We fought against the invisible. We looked to one another for comfort. We held the hands of friends and lovers. We did not turn our backs. We embraced. So that tells us a little bit about these two remarkable couples and a few other remarkable people here in Washington, D.C.
And the little rack card that you showed about Walt Whitman's life that was produced by Rainbow History Project. The Rainbow History Project is beyond even documenting Walt Whitman's time. It has self-guided walking tours that you can look up and download of various DC neighborhoods, 8th Street, Capitol Hill, DuPont Circle. I'm blanking on other ones, but this is a really wonderful resource for folks who are interested in all aspects of Washington, D.C. history.
Yes, yeah, and here I provide a little bit of people who wanted to do some follow-up perhaps, including, we mentioned the Whitman DC Walking Tour, which you can find on Rainbow History Project's website. But in addition, the DC Preservation League deserves so many kudos for their landmark application for the Slowe Burrell House. That's on the DC League's website, and then they will connect you to the Office of Planning's website. But I think if you start at DC Preservation League, it'll be a little bit easier to navigate. And then there's been a really remarkable biography that was written and published a couple of years ago on Lucy Diggs Slowe called Faithful to the Task at Hand. It was begun many, many, many years ago. Carol Miller is no longer with us. He died before the work was finished, but it was finished as an act of love by Anne Pruitt Logan. And then, since I talked about Whitman and Doyle, I thought people, if they were interested in knowing more about Peter Doyle, and of course, who isn't, they can read the biography that I produced on Doyle, which is available on the Walt Whitman Archive website. And then one of our fellow tour guides is Garrett Peck. And a couple of years ago, Garrett Peck produced a book on Whitman's life in Washington, D.C., which is available from History Press. Just a little further reading in case anyone's interested.
If someone was going to just start out their journey with rainbowhistory.org, what would you say is a neighborhood you could start with that would maybe give you a good introduction, or what your appetite for more about DC's LGBTQ history?
Well, I think the two DuPont Circle tours are really terrific. They have a Western tour and an Eastern tour, and that covers a lot of sort of the modern gay history movement. But it also goes back in time, and it covers a lot of the African American contributions to the movement. For example, it goes to Georgia Douglas Johnston's house, the S Street, where she held her S Street salon. Now, I guess we're not quite sure if Johnston was a lesbian. She was married to a man, but widowed for a very long time. But she did mentor both gay and straight African American writers, including people like Mary Burrell and Langston Hughes and others. But that's kind of, those are two really cool tours. There's also a separate African American gay history tour. There's a women's history tour. So there's a lot of different tours that you can follow. I don't know, one is as good as the next, so it's very hard to say which is the best one.
Well, just in the past few days, we've learned that two sites that have been key to DC's LGBTQ history, we're going to lose them because the entities are closing. One is Ziegfeld's Club, and oh shoot, I'm blanking on the other one, Martin.
The other is the Eagle.
Yeah.
Eagle Leather Bar.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Yeah.
So where Ziegfeld's was in different places, but most famously in the area of the city where now Nationals Park is.
Yes. Yeah, and I think its last spot may have been where it's very close to the soccer stadium.
Yeah, that's right.
Remembering correctly.
Right. And actually, it's Ziegfeld's, and it was also The Secret. So it was a really acclaimed drag club that was the Ziegfeld's identity, and then The Secret was, I can't remember. I never went.
I have to admit, I never went there.
But then the Leather Bar has been where?
The Eagle has been a number of different places. I remember from my youth it being over on New York Avenue, right next to the famous Italian restaurant there.
Oh my gosh, the AV restaurant?
Yes, the AV restaurant, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. And then it moved, and I know we have some people listening in, Craig Howell, a good friend of mine, and Rick Rosendahl. They may have a better recollection if they do.
Well, you know who Garrett Peck is with us, and he's reminding me that Secrets was a strip club. So you brought your dollar bills.
Well, I think my partner is listening into this webinar, so I'm not going to claim to any knowledge of these things.
I remember a really well-known performer at Ziegfeld's was someone who portrayed Ella Fitzgerald. And I used to, when I first moved to DC, I got my hair done at Harlow on Connecticut Avenue in DuPont Circle. And the person who cut my hair, Burrell, who was Ella Fitzgerald, his station was right next to. And it was so cool to hear him talk about performing as Ella Fitzgerald. He had a wonderful portrait of himself as Ella at his station.
Yeah, she would be a great one to perform.
So if we're curious more about Eagle, Craig Howell is telling us it started out at 9th and I, then it moved to 7th and I, then it moved to New York Avenue before moving to Benning Road. So it really, that really moved around. Yeah. But sad. Martin, what places in kind of traditional gay spots that are no longer here do you really miss?
Gay spots that I would miss. Well, of course, the rooming houses that Walt Whitman would have lived in. Yeah. That would be pretty important to me. Kim Roberts, who I did the walking tour for Gay Rainbow History, she put together a really cool website with Dan Vera, and it has sites of literary importance that throughout Washington, D.C., and she identified a number of different places. She did one in particular for Walt Whitman, all of the houses that he lived in.
Wow.
And he had a rooming house that was just opposite the Treasury Building, which is now the, it used to be the Washington Hotel. I'm dating myself. What is it called
Oh,
now?
now it's the W.
The W,
Yeah,
the W
Hotel.
Hotel.
Yeah.
And Whitman had his last rooming house was in that particular location. So that's one I would love to see. I don't know. I think I'd sort of throw that out to our audience. What would they like to see? Especially ones that maybe still exist that they'd like to see become the fourth LGBT house.
What would, yeah, I mean, right,
So we have Frank Cameny's home
right.
and the Furies Collective, and now we have the big Slowe house, Slowe
Would
Burrell
it
house.
have to be nominated? Does it need to be, for instance, there's a site well-known and kind of high profile, Annie's Paramount Steakhouse on
Oh,
17th Street in DuPont Circle. So that still operates. But
yes.
then another one that was important and beloved was Lambda Rising Bookstore, but that's been closed for a number of years. So to get the nomination or to be nominated and then get accepted, does the entity still have to be in operation, or could it just be the site is still there?
It would be the site. For example, the Furies Collective had a very, very short life, but it was nominated and accepted, oh, good 30 years after the Furies had folded, essentially. So it wouldn't necessarily have to be a site. And of course, a lot of the people who are associated with the site, usually they prefer honoring, if a person is associated with the site, somebody who's dead. What's
Okay.
interesting about Franklin Kameny, for example, his house was designated a landmark by DC prior to his death, but the National Register of Historic Places would not act upon it until after he died. And then within 2 months of his death, he was listed on the National Register. So there are different things that have to be met in order to meet those requirements.
You know, we should end this since we're both tour guides, and there may be quite a few tour guides listening in. Our fun fact, tour guide fun fact of the day: why, Martin, at DuPont Circle Metro Station is that HIV/AIDS caregivers monument, not a memorial? What is the difference between, why do we name something a monument versus a memorial?
Well, students, memorial honors somebody who is dead. A monument is essentially, usually it honors the living. For example, the Washington Monument, we think, well, by the time it was finally dedicated and completed, George Washington was dead, but it originated when he was alive. You know, remember L'Enfant's original plan was to place a monument to George Washington on that site. So a memorial is honoring the dead. The HIV caregivers monument, as I call it, is honoring the living and the dead. So it's really the caregivers, some of whom have passed away, but many of whom are still living today. And of course, so many people are still living with HIV today. So we have those caregivers. It's an ongoing project.
It's wonderful. Martin, thank you so much for this
Thank you
wonderful
for inviting me.
and for sharing the lives of these 4 people. It was really nice. Thank you so much. And thanks you all to all of you out there who tuned in or clicked in to join us. Next week, let me quickly share my screen. And we'll have next week, we're going to go in a completely different direction. We're going to have the history webinar is going to be called Hands Across DC. And we're going to be joined by my colleague, David Luria, who's the founder of Washington Photo Safari. And he has taken a number of photographs of just the hands of sculptures throughout Washington, D.C. So you're seeing one of the images there. Some of you will recognize that instantly, but I'm not going to give it away. So this webinar will be, we're going to look at a series of images that he has shot of hands of sculptures, see if we can identify who it is. Then he's going to tell us how he got the shot, how to get a good shot like that. And then a Washington Walks tour guide is going to tell us a bit about the sculpture itself. So that'll be kind of a fun one. And then again, this evening, we are with All the President's Men, still considered one of the great, maybe the great film about investigative journalism, as well as a film that really uses Washington, D.C. well to help tell its story. So that's at 7 o'clock. Thanks again, Martin.
Thank you. Enjoyed it.
And thank you all for joining us. Bye-bye.
Bye.